Imagine waking up one day and discovering that someone who hates you, fears you, or simply enjoys watching you suffer, has put a bounty on your life, not in the back alleys of a crime-ridden city. No, your death is being auctioned off on the dark web, a shadowy underworld where money can buy murder like it's just another online transaction. This is not a horror movie. This is not fiction. This happened to Amy Allwine, a loving wife, a mother, a devout Christian. She had no enemies. She wasn't tangled in some shady business. And yet, someone wanted her dead so badly that they were willing to pay a hitman in Bitcoin to make it happen. But here's the twist. Amy wasn't murdered by some faceless assassin from the dark web. Her killer was much closer than she ever realized. This is the horrifying case of Amy Allwine, a woman whose life was shattered by secrets, lies, and a murder plot straight out of a cybercrime nightmare. It all started in 2016 when the FBI received a tip about a disturbing case unfolding on the dark web. Agents had been monitoring a site called Besa Mafia, an underground marketplace that claimed to offer professional hitmen for hire. Customers could place orders for murders, paying in Bitcoin, making transactions nearly untraceable. During an investigation, law enforcement stumbled upon a chilling order, a contract to kill a woman named Amy Allwine. Her full name, home address, daily routine, and even her vehicle details were all included in the request. The person behind the order had provided instructions on how and when the murder should happen, specifying that it should look like an accident. The FBI took the threat seriously. They immediately contacted Amy and her husband, Stephen Allwine, at their home in Cottage Grove, Minnesota. At first, Amy was in complete shock. Who could possibly want her dead? She wasn't involved in any criminal activity, had no enemies, and was well respected in her local church community. The Allwines were a religious couple, active members of their church, and well liked. From the outside, their life seemed perfect. But someone had gone to great lengths to have her murdered. The FBI advised Amy and Stephen to be cautious and increase security around their home. They installed security cameras and started changing up Amy's daily routine to avoid being predictable. The FBI also assured them that many dark web hitmen for hire sites were actually scams, run by criminals who took money but never actually carried out killings. While Amy and Stephen were rattled, they tried to resume normal life, believing that the worst had passed. But they had no idea that this was only the beginning. As the FBI dug deeper into the murder-for-hire plot, they uncovered chilling details. The hit order against Amy Allwine wasn't a vague threat. It was meticulously planned, with precise instructions that only someone familiar with her life could provide. The anonymous individual who placed the order specified Amy's full name, home address, work schedule, car make and model, and even her usual walking routes. The order detailed how she could be eliminated discreetly, suggesting that the murder should look like an accident or a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random act of online cruelty. This was a calculated and methodical assassination request. The hit had been placed on Besa Mafia, a dark cryptocurrency that makes transactions difficult to trace. The hitman-for-hire site offered different services, from beatings to outright murder, with pricing that varied based on the level of risk involved. In Amy's case, the requester had paid thousands of dollars for her murder. But there was an unexpected twist. The hitman never came. Despite the payment and detailed instructions, the contract wasn't fulfilled. Why? Because Besa Mafia wasn't what it claimed to be. Investigators later discovered that Besa Mafia was a scam. It was run by fraudsters who took money from desperate or cruel individuals but never actually carried out any killings. The site operators would collect Bitcoin payments, claim the hit was in progress, and then disappear with the money. Many customers who ordered murders on the site had no idea they were being scammed. However, the person who wanted Amy dead wasn't discouraged by this setback. Instead of giving up, they escalated their efforts. If the dark web couldn't deliver, they had another plan in mind, one far more personal and sinister. After the FBI's warning, the Allwines were on high alert. They had never experienced anything like this before. No warning signs, no hints that someone might want to harm their family. Amy, especially, was deeply shaken. She never imagined that someone would want her dead. She was a mother, a wife, an active member of her community. Her days were spent caring for her family, attending church, and living a quiet, fulfilling life. But now, her peaceful existence had been shattered by the threat of violence. Stephen, though rattled, took action immediately. He increased security around their home and insisted on installing cameras at various entry points. The couple took steps to change their routines, avoiding predictable patterns, and their family began traveling in separate cars in case of an emergency. But no matter how many precautions they took, the fear was always there, lurking in the back of their minds. The FBI gave them a sense of reassurance, but their advice also carried a heavy weight. They told the Allwines that while many dark web hitmen for hire sites were scams, there was still a chance the threat could be real. Law enforcement urged Amy and Stephen to remain cautious, but didn't give any concrete answers about whether the person behind the plot would give up or escalate. As the days passed, the Allwines remained on edge, constantly looking over their shoulders, wondering if the worst was yet to come. Every knock on the door, every car that drove slowly past their house, every unfamiliar face in their neighborhood made Amy's stomach churn with fear. Could it be someone coming to kill her? Or was it just paranoia? Yet, despite the constant tension, the family tried to live as normally as possible. Amy continued with her life, albeit with a nagging feeling that something terrible might be looming just around the corner. She went to church, ran errands, and spent time with her children, trying to maintain the semblance of a normal life. But inside, she knew that a dark shadow hung over her, and the knowledge that someone, somewhere, wanted her dead made it impossible to fully escape the fear. While Amy feared for her life, Stephen remained calm but distant. He reassured her that everything would be fine, that they were doing everything they could to protect themselves. However, behind his words, something was off. His behavior grew increasingly strange in the coming weeks. It wasn't long before the family's attempt at normalcy would come crashing down, and the terrifying truth would finally begin to reveal itself. The real danger wasn't coming from an anonymous stranger on the dark web. It was much closer, much more intimate than anyone could have imagined. Despite the chilling details of the murder contract, the hitmen never showed up. The FBI had been monitoring the dark website and confirmed that a payment had been made for the hit on Amy. They tracked the Bitcoin transactions and confirmed that the payment was genuine, but no hitman ever took action. For a while, this brought the Allwines a sense of relief. The FBI had reassured them that many of these dark web hitman services were just scams, fraudulent websites designed to prey on vulnerable individuals who were looking to solve their problems with violence. In many cases, these sites would take a payment, disappear, and never actually deliver on their promises. In Amy's case, that's exactly what happened. The request for her murder was real, and the payment was made. But after that, nothing. It became clear that the person behind the request had lost its grip. However, this apparent relief was short-lived. What the Allwines didn't know was that the person who had placed the hit on Amy wasn't the type to just give up. While the fraudsters behind Bessa Mafia may have stolen the money and disappeared, the person who ordered the hit was more determined. This was no random attack. Whoever had put Amy's life on the line had a clear, chilling reason for wanting her dead. The Allwines had no idea at this point. But the threats weren't over. In fact, they were only just beginning to escalate. Behind the scenes, the person responsible was already planning the next move. And this time, it wouldn't be an online transaction or an empty threat. They would go after Amy with a new, more dangerous approach. The plans would move from the shadows of the dark web into the real world. While the FBI continued its investigation, the Allwines tried to move forward with their lives, convinced that the worst was behind them. But as Amy began to receive disturbing emails and the unsettling feeling of being watched grew, it became increasingly clear that the nightmare was far from over. It would soon become evident that the true danger wasn't the online hitman. It was the one who had been sitting across from her all along. While the Allwines were still reeling from the shock of the initial threat on the dark web, the situation took a terrifying turn when Amy began to receive a series of anonymous emails. At first, they seemed like nothing more than the words of a random troll or an angry stranger. But as the messages became more frequent, more specific and more aggressive, Amy couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The emails were laced with venomous threats and cruel accusations. The sender claimed to know intimate details about her life, where she went, what she wore, who she spoke to. Some of the messages even included photographs of Amy at different places, taken without her knowledge. It was clear that someone had been watching her, had been following her. And the threats grew more personal with every passing day. The person behind the emails didn't just want Amy dead. They wanted to break her life. They were designed to tear apart everything she had worked so hard to build. In one email, the sender made vile accusations about her family and her personal life, trying to ruin her reputation, to destroy her identity in the eyes of her loved ones and her community. They even sent threats to her church, warning members that they should distance themselves from her, creating a sense of suspicion and distrust. Amy, already shaken from the initial dark web threat, now found herself living in fear every day. The seemingly harmless threats had escalated to something much more sinister. Every time she picked up her phone or checked her inbox, she wondered if today would be the day the nightmare came true. Who could be behind this? What did they want from her? Stephen, her husband, had tried to reassure her at first, but even he began to sense that the situation was spiraling out of control. He told Amy that they would be fine, that the threats were likely just someone trying to scare her. But deep down, both of them knew that the situation was growing more dangerous by the day. The Allwines had no idea just how close the danger was, or who the real enemy was. The terrifying realization that their home was no longer a safe haven was setting in. The predator lurking in the shadows wasn't a faceless figure behind a screen. It wasn't an anonymous cybercriminal. No, the person behind this torment was far closer than they could have ever imagined. As the threats intensified, so did the family's sense of vulnerability. Amy couldn't even step outside her house without looking over her shoulder. Every car that passed by her home seemed to trigger a new wave of anxiety. Could it be the person behind the emails, coming to finish what they had started? Was this the moment she would become a target in real life, not just in the virtual world? And yet, despite all of this, Amy continued to carry on with her life, clinging to whatever sense of normalcy she could. She took extra precautions when leaving her house and began carrying pepper spray, but nothing could shake the underlying fear that the worst was yet to come. The constant tension was taking a toll on her mental and emotional well-being. She could never fully escape the feeling of being hunted. This was no longer a story of online threats. It was no longer about the dark web. This was a real-world conspiracy, one that was growing more dangerous with each passing day. And the Allwines were about to learn just how horrifying this threat truly was. The line between the virtual world and the real world was about to blur, and with it, the true extent of the danger they faced. As the threat of Amy's life continued to loom over her, the Allwines were living in a state of constant vigilance. Amy's fear was palpable. She didn't know who wanted her dead, but with every passing day, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The threats had already torn apart her sense of safety, but the true nightmare was still hidden, buried in the dark corners of her life. What Amy didn't know was that the one person she trusted the most, her own husband, Stephen, was the person behind it all. Stephen Allwine had always appeared to be the devoted, loving husband. He was a man of faith, actively involved in their local church, a good father to their 2 children. To the outside world, he was the picture of stability, a solid foundation for his family. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, Stephen was leading a double life, one that had been carefully hidden from Amy for years. For months, investigators would later uncover, Stephen had been secretly engaging in a series of extramarital affairs. He had been frequenting dating websites, including Ashley Madison, and seeking relationships with other women behind Amy's back. He wasn't just seeking emotional validation. He was looking for something more. He was looking for a way out of his marriage. The pressures of living up to the image of a perfect family man were taking their toll, and Stephen couldn't escape the internal conflict between his outward image and his desires. But Stephen's betrayal didn't stop there. As investigators dug into his digital footprint, they uncovered something far darker: his involvement in the murder-for-hire plot. While Amy believed the threats she was facing were from some random person on the dark web, the truth was far more shocking. Stephen had been the one who placed the contract on his wife's life. Using his access to Bitcoin, he had hired a hitman to kill Amy through the dark web, hoping to cover up his betrayal and start a new life without the burden of his marriage and the constraints of family. What was even more chilling was the precision with which Stephen orchestrated the plan. He had carefully studied his wife's routines, her weaknesses, and the way she trusted him, and used that information to his advantage. Not only did he want to end his marriage, but he was also willing to go as far as to have his wife murdered. Stephen had always been a master of deception, playing the role of the loving husband, the doting father, the faithful church-goer. But behind closed doors, he was planning Amy's death with cold calculation. This betrayal was deeper than anything Amy could have imagined. It wasn't just a random threat from the dark web. It was a deliberate, sinister plot, orchestrated by the one person who should have been protecting her the most. It was the ultimate breach of trust, the kind of betrayal that left Amy questioning everything about the man she had married, the man she had built a life with. As the case unfolded, the horrifying truth came into sharper focus. Stephen Allwine had been the puppet master all along. The man she loved, the man who had vowed to protect her, was the one who had planned her murder. And he wasn't just manipulating her through emails and online threats. He was using his position of trust to get closer to his goal. The darkest part of the whole situation was that Amy had no idea. She had trusted him completely. She had no reason to suspect him, no reason to think that her own husband would be the one pulling the strings behind her near-death experience. The one person who should have been her protector had instead become her greatest threat. As the investigation into Amy Allwine's death began to unfold, the authorities quickly realized that the man they were dealing with was far more complex than they initially believed. Stephen Allwine, the seemingly loving husband and father, had lived a double life, one that he had expertly concealed from his family and the outside world. For years, Stephen had managed to maintain the image of the perfect family man. He was involved in their local church, where he held a position of respect and authority. He presented himself as a devoted father, an upstanding member of the community, someone who believed in family values and faith. But behind closed doors, he was leading a secret life filled with deception, betrayal, and hidden desires. Stephen had been secretly active on multiple dating websites, most notably Ashley Madison, a site designed for people looking to have extramarital affairs. He created a profile under a false name where he portrayed himself as someone interested in casual encounters and illicit relationships. But it wasn't just a few flirtations here and there. It was a full-blown affair. Stephen had been living a double life for years, all the while hiding it from Amy. In their marriage, he had grown increasingly dissatisfied. He felt trapped, suffocated by the responsibilities of family life and the pressures of maintaining the facade of the perfect husband and father. Through his online relationships, Stephen sought excitement, attention, and a break from the demands of his family. He was seeking validation from others to fill the emptiness he felt, and in doing so, he grew further and further detached from his own wife. But the affairs weren't just emotional. Stephen was also looking for a way out of his marriage. He began to entertain the idea that his only escape from his situation might come through something far more drastic. If he could free himself from Amy and their life together, he could start over, and that's when the idea of murder came into play. In his mind, Amy was the obstacle standing in the way of his newfound freedom. The weight of his guilt over the affairs, the strain of keeping up appearances, and his increasing desire to live life on his own terms led Stephen to the dark decision to have Amy killed. He took to the dark web, seeking a hitman who could carry out his plan without ever being traced. He caught Stephen off guard and have him traced. He carefully asserted that, "Look, young man." Using his secret Bitcoin accounts, Stephen placed the hit on his wife's life, even going so far as to provide intimate details about her routine, her schedule, and her physical appearance, everything the assassin would need to carry out the murder. The haunting part of Stephen's double life wasn't just the affairs or the murder-for-hire plot. It was the deep level of manipulation he used to keep up his image as the loving husband. For Amy, it was almost impossible to fathom how the man she had been married to for over a decade, the father of her children, could have harbored such dark intentions. Stephen knew exactly how to play his role. He could turn on the charm, act attentive and caring, and ensure that Amy never suspected a thing. Even after the murder attempt failed and threats against Amy grew, Stephen continued to play the role of the concerned, supportive husband. He was not just hiding his extramarital affairs or his murderous intentions. He was hiding his true nature from everyone who knew him. And it wasn't just Amy who had been deceived. Stephen's church community, his friends, and his family all believed in the image he had crafted for himself. He had masterfully disguised his true self, using his charisma and charm to manipulate others into thinking he was a devoted man of faith, a good husband, a good father. But behind that facade, Stephen was unraveling. The digital traces of his secret life began to emerge. The hidden accounts, the explicit messages, the payments for the hit. And as the investigation progressed, the carefully constructed life he had built over the years would begin to fall apart. What began as a simple affair or a desire for personal freedom transformed into a calculated, cold-blooded murder plot, against his wife. The contrast between Stephen's public persona and the dark reality of his private actions was staggering. On the outside, he was the perfect husband, but beneath it all, he was a man consumed by self-interest, desperation, and a profound lack of empathy. Amy had no idea what she was truly living with, and her trust in him had ultimately become her greatest vulnerability. Stephen's double life had been a carefully constructed performance, but the truth was beginning to come to light, and in the end, it would be his own actions, his own digital footprint that would expose the monster hidden within him. As the investigation continued, the authorities pieced together the full scope of Stephen Allwine's betrayal. While Amy had suspected that someone wanted to harm her, she had no idea that the threat was coming from within her own home. The shocking truth about Stephen's involvement in the plot to kill her was slowly coming to light, and as the details emerged, they painted a horrifying picture of manipulation, deceit, and calculated cruelty. The more investigators dug into Stephen's life, the more they uncovered about his true motivations. His extramarital affairs weren't just about seeking physical or emotional satisfaction. They were a symptom of a much deeper discontent. Stephen had grown weary of his marriage to Amy, and rather than confronting his issues or attempting to work through them, he chose to escape through deceit. But the path of deception didn't stop with the affairs. Stephen's decision to hire a hitman was the ultimate betrayal, one that no one could have predicted. The idea of murdering his wife to escape the life he felt trapped in was the darkest possible course of action, and yet it had become Stephen's plan. Stephen had been harboring his feelings of dissatisfaction for a long time. He had started to view Amy as the obstacle between him and the life he wanted to live, a life without the burden of a family, without the weight of responsibility. But rather than seeking a divorce, or even confronting his feelings, he chose the most extreme solution. He thought that if he could eliminate Amy, he could free himself from the obligations of marriage and parenthood. In the weeks leading up to the murder plot, Stephen's behavior had shifted subtly. He had become more distant, more secretive. While Amy was deeply focused on the strange threats she had received, Stephen's attention was elsewhere, on his online activities, on his extramarital relationships, and on the plans he was making to bring his dark desires to fruition. Amy had been completely unaware of what was going on behind the scenes. She had no idea that the man she loved, the man she trusted with her life, was the one who had placed a target on her back. She had spent years building a life with Stephen, raising their children together, and supporting him in every way she could. She had no reason to believe that her husband could be capable of such a monstrous act, and yet Stephen was plotting her death while continuing to act as the loving husband and father, playing his role in front of her, keeping up the charade for as long as he could. The facade began to crack when the threats escalated. Amy's growing sense of unease, coupled with the disturbing emails and photographs, eventually led her to believe that someone was stalking her. Someone who had been watching her every move. What Amy didn't know at the time was that the person behind these threats was none other than Stephen himself, orchestrating the entire situation to create fear and confusion. Stephen had believed that by escalating the threats, he would increase Amy's anxiety and pressure her into taking drastic measures. He may have hoped that the constant fear would push her to take action, perhaps distancing herself from friends, family, or even the authorities. He knew the more terrified Amy became, the more likely it was that she would rely on him for support and guidance, giving him the opportunity to continue controlling the situation. However, Stephen's plan began to unravel as the investigation took a deeper turn. When investigators looked into his digital footprint, the full scope of his actions came to light. They uncovered his hidden accounts, his communications with women on dating sites, and most damning of all, the Bitcoin transactions tied to the Hitman for Hire service. The authorities connected the dots, revealing that Stephen had been actively pursuing the plot to kill Amy. The once perfect marriage was now revealed as a lie, a web of deceit spun by a man who was desperate to escape the consequences of his own actions. The image of the loving husband, the devoted father, the upstanding churchgoer, all came crashing down. Stephen Allwine's true nature was exposed for the world to see. The heartbreak for Amy was immeasurable. The man she had spent years with, the father of her children, had been plotting her murder behind her back. The pain of discovering that Stephen was capable of such an act, that he had been deceiving her all along, was beyond comprehension. Amy was left to face the devastation of not just losing her trust in him, but also the brutal realization that she had been living in a marriage built on lies and manipulation. Stephen's double life had finally caught up with him, and the consequences were dire. Amy's life had been placed in jeopardy, and Stephen's actions were about to destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. His marriage, his reputation, and his family. The perfect marriage was exposed as a facade, and in its place was a twisted, tragic reality that would haunt both Amy and Stephen for the rest of their lives. The revelations about Stephen Allwine's actions sent shockwaves through the community. What had once been a picture-perfect family was now unraveling in front of everyone. Amy was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, grappling with the horror of knowing that her husband, the man she had trusted above all else, had tried to have her killed. The emotional toll on her was immense. The betrayal of a lifetime wasn't just a personal loss. It was a complete collapse of her sense of security and stability. The immediate aftermath of the investigation was a whirlwind of emotions for Amy. She had to process the shock and disbelief that the man she had spent over a decade with, raised children with, and built a life around, was capable of plotting her murder. Amy's emotional recovery was compounded by the fact that her 2 children had been living in the same house as this monster, unaware of the danger they were in. Stephen's actions didn't just hurt Amy. They jeopardized the safety and well-being of their children, who were now left without a father in their lives. Amy was understandably traumatized by the entire ordeal. The thought that she had been living in a home with someone capable of such evil, and that he had manipulated her into trusting him, was almost too much to bear. The guilt she felt for not seeing the signs earlier, for not questioning Stephen's behavior, haunted her. But amid the trauma, she found strength in knowing that she was still alive, that she had been able to survive the attempt on her life, and that she had the opportunity to rebuild her life. For Amy, the road to recovery would be long and painful, but it was one she was determined to take. For Stephen, the consequences of his actions were swift and severe. His arrest was the beginning of a legal battle that would further expose his lies, his manipulation, and his utter disregard for the life of his wife. In the months that followed, Stephen was charged with attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and a variety of other criminal offenses tied to his betrayal. The trial that followed was a spectacle, with the world watching as Stephen's darkest secrets were laid bare in a courtroom. His defense team tried to argue that Stephen was under emotional stress, that his infidelity and dissatisfaction with his marriage were contributing factors, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of a man who, rather than dealing with his issues in a responsible way, chose to resort to murder as a solution to his problems. They detailed how Stephen had meticulously planned the hit on his wife, using the dark web, and how he had acted with cold, calculated malice. Throughout the trial, Amy sat in the courtroom, facing the man who had once been her partner, her confidant, the father of her children. Every day was a painful reminder of the depths of Stephen's deception. Except there were 2 summers when they sat in the same class, and time flew by. She listened as the prosecution outlined how Stephen had tried to manipulate her, control her, and ultimately have her killed to escape his own feelings of discontent. But the woman in the courtroom was different from the vulnerable wife who had once depended on Stephen. Amy was now a survivor, stronger, more determined to move on, and determined to ensure that her children knew the truth about their father. In the end, the jury found Stephen Allwine guilty of attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The sentencing hearing was another emotional experience for Amy, who had to face Stephen once again. This time, however, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't the woman who had once trusted him implicitly. She was a woman who had been betrayed, but had survived. And now, she would no longer let his actions define her life. Stephen was sentenced to several decades in prison, a sentence that, while long, did little to ease the pain and trauma he had inflicted on Amy and their children. In prison, Stephen's life took a turn that many hadn't expected. The man who had been so adept at manipulation, so skilled at presenting a facade of normalcy, was now facing the consequences of his own actions. In the harsh reality of prison life, he became a figure of scorn and contempt, his crimes widely known and despised. The very thing he had worked so hard to escape, the consequences of his betrayal, had caught up with him. While Stephen's life behind bars would be a stark contrast to the one he had once known, for Amy, the road to healing was just beginning. She faced the challenge of rebuilding her life, with the knowledge that the person she had once trusted with everything had been the one to try to destroy it all. But she was determined not to let his actions define her future. Amy moved forward with the support of her family, friends, and community, finding solace in the knowledge that she had survived a nightmare and that she could build a new life, free from the man who had tried to end hers. Stephen's betrayal would never be forgotten, but for Amy and her children, the future held the promise of healing, renewal, and strength. The trauma would never disappear, but Amy was committed to showing her children that they could rise above the darkness, no matter how deeply it had tried to invade their lives. And although the wounds would take time to heal, Amy's journey was one of resilience and courage, a journey that would eventually lead her back to a place of peace and hope. The trial and conviction of Stephen Allwine marked the end of a dark chapter in Amy's life, but for her and her children, it also signified the beginning of a long and challenging journey toward healing. The road ahead was not going to be easy. The road ahead was not going to be easy. The scars of betrayal, manipulation, and the fear of living in a home where her life had been endangered would stay with Amy forever. The psychological toll of Stephen's actions would continue to echo through her life in ways she could not have imagined when she first learned of the plot against her. Yet, through it all, she found strength that she never knew she had. The immediate aftermath of the trial was a period of immense emotional strain. Amy was flooded with emotions. Relief that her ordeal was finally over, but also deep sorrow for the loss of her marriage and the man she had once loved. While she knew she had to move forward, the weight of everything that had happened still hung heavy. The life she had once dreamed of with Stephen was now shattered, and the trust she had placed in him was gone forever. But despite all the pain, Amy had a sense of hope that began to rise within her. The journey to healing would be long, but it was one she was committed to taking for herself and for her children. The support system that Amy had around her played a pivotal role in her recovery. Her family, friends, and even her church community rallied around her. They provided emotional support, helping her process the trauma and grief she had experienced. The love and care she received helped her see that, despite the nightmare that had been her marriage, she was not alone. Her strength came from the people who genuinely cared about her, who reminded her that she was worthy of love, happiness, and peace. But the healing process wasn't just about relying on others. Amy also had to work through her own feelings of guilt, shame, and fear. She had to confront the difficult reality that her ex-husband had been capable of such dark actions. She had trusted him with everything, her heart, her future, her children. And he had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. The pain of that realization was something she had to face head-on. And in doing so, Amy began to discover her own inner strength. Therapy became a vital part of Amy's recovery. Speaking with a professional allowed her to process the trauma of the experience in a safe and controlled environment. Through therapy, Amy learned that she was not responsible for Stephen's actions. She had been a victim of his manipulation and deceit, and none of what happened was her fault. Therapy also gave her tools to work through the complex emotions she was experiencing: anger, fear, sadness, and even moments of numbness. She learned to acknowledge and process her emotions rather than burying them. For Amy, forgiving herself was one of the most difficult parts of the healing process. She felt responsible in some way, asking herself, "Why didn't I see the signs? And how did I not know?" But over time, she realized that Stephen's ability to hide his dark side was part of what made him so dangerous. He had been a master manipulator, carefully crafting a version of himself that was impossible for her to question. In the end, it wasn't her fault, it was his. The forgiveness had to start with herself. Throughout the process, one of the most difficult aspects was explaining the situation to her children. The emotional impact of their father's actions was profound. They had to process the fact that the man they once called Dad had not only betrayed their mother, but had also endangered their lives. Amy worked with therapists and counselors to help her children navigate their feelings. She was committed to creating a safe space for them to express their confusion, anger, and hurt. Over time, Amy helped them understand that they were not responsible for their father's actions, and that the love and safety they now had were the most important things. Her children's strength and resilience gave Amy hope. They may have been scarred by the events that transpired, but they were also incredibly brave. They were learning, together with Amy, how to rebuild their lives and look to the future. A future that, despite the pain they had endured, was still filled with love and hope. Amy's own path to recovery was a mix of small victories and setbacks. Some days were easier than others, and there were moments when the weight of everything that had happened would hit her all over again. Yet, with time, she began to rediscover parts of herself that she had lost along the way. She found joy in simple moments: watching her children play, taking walks, laughing with friends, and she started to trust again, not just in others, but also in herself. Amy had been through an ordeal that would have broken many people, but instead, she emerged from it with an unwavering determination to live her life on her terms. She also found strength in the knowledge that she was no longer a victim of her circumstances. The situation that had once seemed impossible to escape from, with a husband who had plotted her death, was now behind her. Amy was free to define her own future, one where she was no longer tied to the shadow of Stephen's actions. She was no longer a woman caught in the web of lies and deceit. She was a survivor, and that fact would always define her more than any of the darkness that had once threatened to consume her. Eventually, Amy began to speak publicly about her experiences, sharing her story with others who might be going through similar struggles. She became an advocate for victims of domestic violence, emotional abuse, and manipulation. She used her voice to empower others, to let them know that they too could overcome even the darkest of situations. Amy's transformation was a testament to the human capacity for resilience, and she would spend the rest of her life helping others find their strength. Through it all, Amy learned a profound lesson, that the most important part of healing was not about forgetting what had happened, but about finding a way to move forward, to take the pieces of your broken life and rebuild it into something even stronger. And in that rebuilding, she found peace. A peace that no one could ever take away from her again. As the years passed, Amy's life gradually transformed from the nightmare she had endured into something that spoke to her incredible strength. She was no longer defined by the betrayal or the horror of her past. Instead, she had become a beacon of resilience, a living testament to the power of surviving, healing, and reclaiming one's life in the face of unimaginable betrayal. The woman who had once feared for her life, who had been manipulated by the person she trusted most, had become someone entirely different. A woman who had rebuilt herself from the ashes of her past. Stephen's prison sentence would serve as a reminder of the evil he had unleashed. But for Amy, the true victory was in the life she was now building. She found peace in her own company, joy in the smiles of her children, and a renewed sense of purpose in helping others who were suffering in silence. Through her pain, she had found her voice and her purpose, turning the deepest hurt into a source of healing for others. In the end, Amy's story wasn't just about survival. It was about triumph. She took back control of her life, not as the victim of her circumstances, but as the woman who had faced the darkest of times and emerged victorious. She proved that no matter how deep the betrayal, how cold the threat, the human spirit has the power to rise again. And in that rise, there is not just survival. There is rebirth. Amy knew that the road would never be without its challenges. But as she walked forward, she walked not in the shadow of what had happened, but in the light of what she had become. And that light would never dim.